Frankenstein has been the dream project of Guillermo del Toro for literally decades at this point, and Netflix is the studio that finally stepped forward to give him the budget and the creative freedom that he needed to make it. And this really does feel like the dream marriage between filmmaker and source material, because if you know anything about Guillermo del Toro and his catalog, it seems like he would have invented Frankenstein and his monster even if it hadn't been written 200 years ago. So, for those of you who don't know, Frankenstein is based on the 200-year-old novel by Mary Shelley that tells the story of a brilliant but egotistical scientist who brings a creature to life in a monstrous experiment that ultimately leads to the undoing of both the creator and his tragic creation. When it comes to these long awaited passion projects that an artist has in the back of their mind for years and years before they finally have the authority and the funding to get them created, sometimes there's a phenomenon that can occur where the projects are a bit anticlimactic. And I think this is because at times the artist forgets to innovate the idea. They had the initial spark of inspiration in their childhood and they held on to it for years, but after they've put out a pretty substantial body of work, what we end up with is a product that feels like it could have been made by a much less mature and less experienced artist. Now, that is not the case with Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein. This film is absolutely wonderful. One thing that you know you're going to get out of a Del Toro film is a beautiful production, and Frankenstein is no exception. This thing is absolutely gorgeous. GDT and his DP Dan Lawston capture every frame in a way that feels almost painterly, even when the events that are being depicted are kind of hideous in nature. There are certain shots that I seriously wouldn't mind having blown up and framed on my wall. In particular, some shots featuring an icy horizon with a sunset in the background that are just so breathtakingly gorgeous. The set decorations and costumes were so lush and detailed, evoking a certain time and place without sacrificing the more fantastical elements of this story, because at the end of the day, it is kind of a sci-fi fairy tale, and it does maintain that feeling. And Guillermo's really putting to work that reported $120 million production budget, with so many shots featuring dozens, if not hundreds of extras on real sets in real locations that feel so tangible and lived in. And they give this film a textured feeling that CGI and green screens could never provide. And the film isn't just a pretty presentation, and that is a concern with some Guillermo del Toro movies. I find that although they're always beautiful to look at, sometimes they leave a bit to be desired narratively and thematically. But I think that this movie is actually one of the best written movies from Del Toro. It makes sense that the plotting feels very literary given the source material, and I haven't read the book for a really long time, so I can't necessarily vouch for how loyal it is, but it feels to me structurally and even in the dialogue as if much of it is pulled directly from the text. And I would not be surprised at all to learn that Del Toro really treated the original text as kind of his Bible while making this film. Unsurprisingly, considering his resume, Del Toro is very fascinated by the horror aspects of this story, in particular the logistics involved with creating a monster like the one that Frankenstein creates. A lot of screen time is dedicated to exploring the supply chain, shall we say, that would be involved with creating a body out of dozens of battered corpses. It's really wince-inducing stuff that made me very glad that this film was in the hands of Del Toro, who is willing to lean into the more grisly elements of this story. And the film leans really heavily into the story's themes of humanism and trauma and nature versus nurture and the role of a parent in a child's upbringing. There are certain aspects of Victor Frankenstein's childhood and the trauma that he suffered at the hands of his father that really inform the way that he responds when his creation isn't living up to his expectations. And it's really cathartic and moving stuff, and it asks a lot of the performers. And the acting here is really great across the board. Oscar Isaac, as this deeply human version of Dr. Frankenstein, is constantly pushing his character almost over the edge past the point of relatability, but at just the right moment, I found that his humanity would shine through enough for me to stay sympathetic enough to be really engaged by him and invested in his emotional arc. But the standout here, and probably the headline for a lot of people, is Jacob Elordi, who has been putting out great performances for years at this point, but this is probably the most impressive role thus far in his career. So much is asked of Elordi before his character is even able to communicate verbally. The second he's on screen, he has to ingratiate himself to the audience without words. And so he employs body language and just emoting through his eyes, largely because his face is covered with prosthetics and makeup. But immediately his presence was so tangible in the movie, and I just instantly wished him well and was hoping that he wouldn't be hurt by this world that he didn't even ask to be a part of. I think this is really a landmark performance in his career, and I hope it opens up the floodgates for a lot more roles to pour through that are as interesting and as challenging as this one. Mia Goth is also in the film, and her role doesn't have a ton of screen time, but I do think that she's incredibly important. She sort of instills the movie with a sense of humanness in some of its bleaker moments, and she is really fantastic throughout. And it's not surprising at all to see that she is one of the most in-demand actresses at the moment. She's just churning out great roles, just like Elordi. Where the film falters for me a bit is in its pacing. It clocks in at about 2.5 hours, and yet I still felt that certain elements of the story were kind of glossed over by the screenplay. Unfortunately, some really interesting elements too. Christoph Waltz's character is essentially the sponsor of Dr. Frankenstein's work. He's giving him funding to complete these experimentations and to run these tests and try to assemble this human being out of all of these corpses and animate it. We don't really understand why he's putting forth so much money and so much time in order to make sure that Frankenstein has everything that he needs. When it becomes clear to us, it's really investing. It was one of the most jarring moments of the film, in my opinion, a really staggering realization. But the problem is that it happens while some other events are happening concurrently that kind of overshadow it. And it happens so fast that we don't really have time to process the information. And when the credits rolled, I immediately found myself returning to that moment and wishing that I knew a bit more. And there are a few scenes like that where I just found myself wishing that I knew more about what was on certain characters' minds at certain very pivotal moments in the story. Also, while I've been praising the film's commitment to doing things practically wherever possible, there are a few scenes that just can't be captured without CGI. And I don't really fault the film for that, and the CGI is even pretty good. But I would be lying if I said that I wasn't pulled out of the experience a bit when certain CGI animals are on screen during moments that are supposed to be really impactful for very prominent characters. I just didn't really buy what I was seeing on screen, and I found those scenes to be substantially weaker than the rest of the film. But again, Del Toro is fully committed to capturing everything on location with real extras, with real prosthetics and makeup, as opposed to using special effects as much as possible. It's just that at times, CGI is required, and I did notice. Overall, I loved Frankenstein. While it does leave some interesting psychological exploration on the table, and while it does rely too heavily on CGI at times, it's a gorgeous and heartfelt interpretation of one of the most iconic texts in existence that plays on the strengths of the novel's concept and Del Toro's masterful visual storytelling to craft one of the best films of the entire year. And for all of those reasons, Frankenstein is going to get an A-. Guys, this is going to be streaming on Netflix this weekend, but if you do have the opportunity to see it in a theater, please do. This thing deserves to be seen as big and loud as you can possibly find it. It's one of the best experiences you'll have in a theater this year. If you have seen it, let me know what you thought of it in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you at the movies.